All right, Mendelian Genetics. Mendelian. Of course, that word comes from a guy by the name of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was a monk, and he was a monk who did genetic experiments. He used to grow plants in his garden. Typically, the most common example was his pea plants. And of course, peas make little peas that we like to eat, right? And he noticed that the peas could be different colors. They could be yellow peas or they could be green peas. And he noticed that sometimes you could have peas that sort of were all smooth on the outside, and sometimes the peas were all wrinkly on the outside. And he started to wonder, what's going on? How come these peas have these different things? And he began to do all kinds of experiments, and he developed the understanding of genetics that eventually we were able to verify with our technology. But remember, Gregor Mendel knew nothing about DNA or genes or anything like that. So he did it all simply by experimental evidence, which then proved true the more we looked at it. Now, before Mendel, let's go before Mendel. And just to give you a timeline, Mendel was he was 1882 to 1884. Sorry, 1822. That would have been very young, 2 years old, to 1884. So he lived to be 62 years old. So he did most of his genetic work, probably somewhere in the middle of this this time frame. So we're talking mid 1800s here. That's the time. But before Mendel, people knew, that obviously there was a way that something came from mom and dad in babies. We could see that babies resembled their parents. They had similar shapes and forms. They had similar eyes, nose, mouth, whatever. They even had similar temperaments, which is weird. Like their behaviors were kind of similar, and their emotional states were similar. Well, your grandfather had a really bad temper, and now you inherited that bad temper from grandpa, and you have to start to wonder, how does this happen? So they had some very interesting theories. The Greeks, early Greeks, way back now, we're talking like thousands of years ago. The Greeks basically had this idea which they called Pangenesis. Pangenesis. And essentially what that means is that the sperm and the egg, well, they didn't really even know about the sperm and the egg, right? They knew, sort of. They knew that there's something that comes from the man, but they really didn't know what was going on inside the women, because they couldn't see the egg cells, and they really couldn't, it's all happening inside. They didn't have microscopes or technology. And so there was this idea that somehow the woman had I guess you could call them particles, woman particles, and the man had man particles, and they called them pangenes. Pangenes, that's maybe where the word gene comes from originally. And basically, the pangenes were essentially little particles that became the parts of your body, right? So the particle, there'd be like a little foot particle and a little kidney particles and all the different parts. And of course, included in that would be little penis and vagina particles for boys and girls type thing. And then when the baby grew, it would just grow from each of these particles, right? So basically particles for each part of the body type of thing. And it wasn't a bad idea, if you think about it. It makes some sense. And so because they lacked the scientific method of inquiry, they did not understand yet that there was a way to base your ideas in science by doing experiments and studying. And they didn't have the wherewithal or the technology to do it. They just kind of said, okay, good idea. That's what we'll do. We'll call it that. And that was it. That was the end of the story. Obviously, this did not stand the test of the scientific method. There was no evidence that could be found to prove that this was the case. Then our friend that I just talked about a little while ago, in about 1677, just to show you how far we've come. That was kind of the weird idea for many thousands of years. The truth is, nobody really knew what the heck was going on. Luan Hawk came up with this idea with his microscope, right? Remember, he invented his microscope, and he actually found a sperm cell. He looked at sperm cells for the first time, swimming around. Now, here's the funny thing. His microscope wasn't very good. It was very primitive, but he was able to see these cells. What he imagined, what he imagined he was seeing was this. A tiny little miniature human in the head of the sperm with a tail that swam around for some reason to get where it was going. And so he envisioned that the male basically deposited a tiny human into the female. And the female was essentially just the storage and a manufacturing factory. In other words, the infant or the baby came entirely from the male, and the woman was basically just the vessel in which the human was deposited to grow. Okay? If you think about that, you might also think sociologically about how in the past we traced family trees on the male side. It was all about the male. We carried the male's name. Everything was about the man. Well, if your scientific or your pre-scientific idea is that the man is depositing the human in and the woman is just the oven, right? A bun in the oven, we say, as when we're talking about being pregnant, then this kind of makes sense that everything should sort of hinge on the man. Now, of course, this again was not able to stand the test of improved scientific methods. So it, of course, did not carry on very far. Another interesting theory, what was happening was in the 1800s, it became popular to grow plants. People were like, "Oh, look, I have plants, ornamental plants." Don't forget, by this time, there was a lot of world trade and movement, right? People had discovered other continents, and so you could get a plant from China or seeds. You could get stuff, yeah. Oh, the guy's name in before here, I didn't write his name. It was Van, and then he's got a weird name, I better spell it right, Luan Hawk. Leuwenhoek. Luan Hawk. That was his name. His name isn't important, right? It's just we're just getting an idea of what people thought over the years. People would plants. Plants were popular. And so people were like, "Ooh, I want to grow this fancy little plant." And so they started growing plants. And of course, when you start growing plants, you start to realize that when you get the seeds of this plant and the seeds of another plant and you put them together, that sometimes the two seeds or the two plants that produce the seeds are contributing both in some way. What they noticed was the blending of traits. The blending of traits, right? So, like for instance, to show you this, you could get the pollen from a plant that has red flowers, right? And maybe the plant had red and white flowers. Maybe there were two different kinds. There was a red version and a white version. So if you took the pollen from the plant that has red flowers and you crossed it, or you put it into the plant, sprinkled it on the pistil of the plant that had white flowers, they started to notice weird things. The result, when you put these two together, could be a plant with white flowers, or a plant with red flowers, or a plant with pink flowers, kind of like the two combined. So they started to realize that Van Leeuwenhoek's idea of the man giving everything and the woman just holding the baby to maturity, that isn't the case. It's possible for both the male and the female to contribute to the baby because they noticed that there was this pink flowers, right? So you could get red, white, and sometimes pink. In other words, there were all kinds of variations, and the only way to explain them was if both the male and the female, or both parents, were somehow giving something to the babies. And that kind of leads us to where Gregor Mendel comes in. So now we get to Gregor Mendel in the mid-1800s. And he grew pea plants in his garden. He was a monk. It was quite common back then for monks and priests and people who were in religious sort of capacities to also dabble in a little bit of science on the side, which is kind of interesting. But don't forget, science was in its infancy at this time, and so they were just kind of figuring it out. It's possible that, you know, they had more time than other people. If you're a monk in a monastery, you have more time than the poor guy who's got to go in the coal mine every day for 12 hours a day and get coal. He doesn't have time to grow pea plants and think about where pink flowers come from, right? He's got work to do. So perhaps Gregor Mendel had the time. And so he grew these pea plants. And basically, we're gonna focus on a couple of the different traits that he noticed. So we all know what a pea is, right? Well, a pea, it turns out, came in two particular colors, he noticed. There were green peas. When the plants matured and produced the peas in the pod, we got green peas. But other plants made kind of yellowy peas. I don't know if you've ever seen yellow peas. They're not as common as green peas, but you can buy them at the store, yellow peas. They're both the same species of plant. They're both peas, but one was green and one was yellow. And the other thing he noticed was that it was possible to get peas that sort of had a, I'll draw these in a different color. I'll just draw them in black. It was possible to get peas, well, maybe I can do it like this. These green peas could either be nice and smooth on the outside, or they came out rather sort of all wrinkled. So we had smooth options and wrinkly peas. Wrinkled. And the same with the yellow ones. The yellow ones could come out nice and smooth, or sometimes they would sort of come out all wrinkled, depending on the plant. And so he noticed these variations, and he decided to actually do some experiments. Now, it's not that hard to experiment with plants, because remember how they work. The pea produces a little flower, and the flower has anthers, which produce the pollen, right? And it has the pistil, which is the female part. So think about the Easter lily at home when you're in Easter time, and you see that, you can see that yellow dust. You could take a Q-tip, and you could gather up the yellow pollen from one of the flowers, and you could bring it over to another flower, and you could dab it onto the green pistil in the middle. There, you've just basically done the bee's job, and you have pollinated the plant. So by doing so, you can control. You can say, I'm going to take this one, which is the green pea producing parent, and I'm going to cross it. That's what we call it when you take the pollen from one and you cross the mother with the father. And I'm going to take it over here, and I'm going to put it on this yellow pea plant and cross it and see what the offspring become. That flower would then produce seeds. The seeds would grow. And of course, it didn't take very long. In a season or two, you could grow sometimes more than 2 or 3 generations of plant. So you didn't have to wait, like for humans, it's hard to do this because you got to have a baby, right? 9 months. Then you got to wait about 20 years before it has its own baby. So you can only study in your own lifetime a few generations of humans. But you could study hundreds of generations of pea plants over a long period of time. So the fact that these plants reproduce quite quickly enabled Mendel to do all kinds of experiments like that. Okay? So he said, well, I have to call this something. So he called the smoothness or the wrinkliness or the yellowness or the greenness a trait. So the word trait refers to the characteristics, you might say. Characteristics like green, yellow, whoa, yellow, wrinkled, or smooth. And of course, we use this word today to describe people, their traits, right? You might be tall, you might be short, you might have red hair, you might have browny hair or blonde hair, you might be, short-tempered, or you might be very calm and cool and collected. You might have blue eyes or brown eyes or combinations of that. These are all what we call traits. They're just basically the idea that you have these characteristics. And of course, somehow, these characteristics get passed on to offspring. That was kind of what he was thinking. So his goal was to try to figure out how this works. So first of all, he noticed when you breed plants, right, you could specifically make it so that you always knew exactly what you were going to get, right? He basically said that he called it true breeding. And this is an important thing to realize because we're going to use this word many times to help us determine actual examples. So true breeding basically means they will produce the same results no matter what, generation after generation. Produce the same results generation after generation. So another way to put that would be that if the plant had red flowers, or let's use his peas, if it had round peas. So for example, he would do the cross, or he would breed the plants and he would get round peas. He would breed them again and he would get round peas. Breed them again and get round peas. And never once did he see a wrinkly pea or a different trait. And so what he realized is that this particular plant that he was working with, and all the plants that were in this sort of this breeding group, they must all have the same sort of thing that they're passing on, because you're not getting any differences. So that's what true breeding means. It simply means you're always going to get the same result. So it gives you an idea. It's kind of like a control in an experiment, right? It's kind of like a standard. We can be pretty certain that this green pea producing plant, no matter what I do, is always going to have, or is always going to give whatever that greenness is. It's going to donate that trait every time. So that was the idea of true breeding. And then, of course, we have the idea of a cross. So a cross is when you take pollen from one pea, which remember is sperm, right? And combine it artificially with the egg cell of another. But of course, you do this, Mother Nature does this pretty much randomly, right? Bees fly around and they bring pollen all over the place. But we do this very selectively, so that in the experiments, we can control who breeds with what, and that can help us learn what's going on. If it was just watching Mother Nature do it randomly, it's too hard to see all the differences, right? So it was the importance of being able to do this very selectively. Okay. So then he said, okay, what's inside that carries the trait? What carries the trait, in other words, was the question. What in the round pea plant is holding on to, or is translating this idea of roundness or wrinkliness? And he said, I don't really know, but I know there's something in there. And so he called it a factor. He said, everything has factors, right? That was the word he used, because he didn't know. Later, 100 years later, we found out that the factors that Mendel was talking about are actually what we call genes. And they do exist, and we've actually found them. So you see, his idea is more scientific, because he said there were these things called factors, right? It could have been leprechauns for all we knew, but nobody found them. And then 100 years later, were like, wow, look at this. We found the actual things that are the factors for genetics. So we verified Mendel's idea, and that's why his idea was better than the idea that a sperm is a baby human waiting to grow, right? Or other things that we never found evidence for. So a factor. Later, we would call this a gene. But of course, he didn't know that word yet. And we also know later we would realize that a gene is actually a sequence of nitrogenous bases on a DNA molecule. And we would understand the chemistry of how they work and how they reproduce themselves and how they're copied and how they turn their information into the formation of a protein. So all that science that has happened has completely verified this idea that Gregor Mendel had. Okay. So here's what Mendel did. He started to take plants and cross them and see what kind of results he would get. So he studied one trait at a time. So it didn't matter what other things happened to the plant. He was just focusing on one trait in what's called a monohybrid cross. A monohybrid cross. All right. Now, before we can do this monohybrid cross, we have to sort of understand a little bit about the results of his experiments, because it was the results of the experiments that brought us back to what was going on. So he was smart enough to know that there's something coming from the mother or from the egg cell, and also something coming from the sperm cell. Because remember, they were seeing combinations like pink flowers from a red mommy and a white daddy. So they knew that there had to be something. And they didn't know about mitosis or meiosis or chromosomes or haploid numbers and none of that. But what he suggested is there must be something that comes from mom and from dad. And so he said that there are two factors for a trait. And one comes from the female, the other from the male. All right? And we need a name for this. So these factors were called alleles. Alleles. So an allele is essentially a different form of the same factor or gene. A different form of the same factor or gene. So I'm gonna use an example that we've used before. I'll put gene in the brackets here because he didn't know about genes. Remember we talked about how you have a skin color that is determined, at least in part, by how much melanin your body produces. So remember in meiosis, we talked about the fact that there were two firemen, there were two lawyers, right? You had homologous pairs of chromosomes, each of which did the same sort of job, but did it slightly differently. Remember? So you had one melanin-producing gene that produced more melanin than another one that produced slightly less, or maybe none at all. And so the different combinations would mean you might get much more melanin or a little bit less, and you get different skin colors and tones. And so those two different homologous chromosomes are what we actually found out are represented by these alleles. Each homologous chromosome has a gene on it that does the same job, but they're slightly different. So we call those two slightly different jobs alleles. So we would say that the boy fireman is an allele of the girl fireman. They do the same jobs, but they look a little different. Got it? So that's the word that we will use, is the allele. And then, of course, Mendel realized that there had to be something called the law of segregation. This is another thing that he after doing many experiments, remember, segregation. So segregation is basically all about how you either how you sort out, right? How you sort. And in a sense, his law of segregation means that he summarized all this that we were talking about. So basically, that there are two alleles for each factor, or I'll keep using the word gene in brackets because that's essentially what it is. Two alleles for each factor, and of course, one comes from the mother, one comes from the father, one from the male, one from the female, but what he realized is that the combinations of these and the way that they were sort of segregated or sort of separated. He was thinking about meiosis, right? And he didn't know about that, but he was trying to describe in his own way what happens in meiosis, where the traits get lined up and the homologous chromosomes get pulled apart. He didn't know anything about that, so he basically said that a sperm and an egg must have only one of the alleles. So in other words, they have to get sorted in the formation of sperms and eggs. There must be a sorting or a segregation so that you can only get one of the alleles from each parent. And that was basically the idea. Then he also noticed something else. He noticed that there were different kinds of alleles. So different alleles were expressed differently. He used the word expressed to describe, okay, if you had an allele for brown eyes, all right, then let's see what the baby looks like. Does it have brown eyes? Well, if the allele is expressed, then yes, you'd have brown eyes. But what he found was you might have got a blue eye allele from dad and a brown eye allele from mom. Same gene, right? Same gene, but they're slightly different. They both do eye color, but one is blue and one is brown. And then you look at the babies. Well, what's the baby? Oh, the baby has brown eyes. So he would say, well, it was the brown allele that was expressed, and the blue one wasn't. And then you look at the next baby. Oh, it has brown eyes. So the brown allele is expressed, and the blue one wasn't. And then he would look at, oh, this one, came out with blue eyes. How did that happen? Blue allele was expressed. So he was trying to figure out, how do you know which allele is going to be the one the baby is going to express? If you get a blue eye allele from mom and a brown eye from dad, what's going on? There has to be a way to figure out what the babies are going to have. So different alleles were expressed differently. And he came up with the idea that in some cases, one allele sort of trumped the other. Right? Using that word today means a whole different thing now with the American politics, but that one allele trumped the other. In other words, he called it the dominant allele. So dominant means you're sort of the one that will be expressed no matter who the other one is. It's like you're more powerful somehow than the other one. And the other one, which didn't seem to get expressed, he called it the recessive allele. So a recessive allele is one that is kind of hidden or masked by a dominant allele. So in other words, there wasn't just two different forms of the gene. One seemed to be more powerful. One was Captain Marvel and the other was Aquaman. Right? Captain Marvel, in case you don't realize it, is pretty much a god, all-powerful. And Aquaman talks to fish. Right? His power is maybe not so great. So that was the idea of dominant and recessive. So then he started to make up a way to keep track of all this. So that's what we're going to learn today. The monohybrid cross, the way that he did it. But I think what we will do is we'll stop this video here. It's been a half an hour, so it's a good intro, and then we'll start a new video for the monohybrid cross. Okay? So basically that's as far as we want to go.